All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Friday, March 4th of 2022. Thanks for tuning into the stream here today. We've got a pretty busy show on tap. A lot of questions already in our queue. We'll start things off with a bit of a walkthrough from a user who posted, I think this was James in our Slack, or not James, I'm sorry. Danny here posted this, mix the name up, but a bit of a walkthrough through a potential NBA process. I wanted to kind of provide a couple of my thoughts here on the process overall, just a couple thoughts. So we'll start there. And then I see a bunch of questions already in the Office Hours channel in Slack about late swap, about value, research builds, some more conversation there. Couple questions about rank versus unique fills in the entry editor. A lot of variety here, a lot of different questions in our queue already. So we'll go ahead and dive right in. Before we get started, as always, if you've got questions for me for today's show, pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack, pop them into YouTube chat, and we will go ahead and get started. So I am not going to read this whole message out here. What I'm going to do here is, let's do this. So this, again, is a question from Danny here. You know what? Let's put some of this in here. Let's read the question, at least as a starting point here. So, okay. So the question says, had some success, new to Slack, had some success in NBA, playing the mini-max, it looks like, taken first through fifth place about 7 times this season, which is great. That's, actually pretty impressive rate so far this season. Feeling lucky with the simulator. Results are inconsistent day by day. That is definitely to be expected. And I utilize the same filter settings nearly every day. Here are the settings I've been using. So let's talk about these first. I'll give some thoughts about the settings overall that have been used. And then we'll go from there. Oh gosh, let's see here. Okay. So a lot of settings set here in Danny's process. So the first, it looks like there is a project. Okay, so a couple player filters, at least 20 minutes, at least 20 fantasy points, at least 25 minutes, at least 12 real life basketball points, a locked utility spot for point guard, and a rule that you must have exactly 3 players from the same team. Along with that, so then it looks like there's a note here, spot checking Vegas odds and picking out particular teams that have a high Vegas total, and then the default slider values here for the sliders. So, okay, so overall, a few thoughts I have on this. So first of all, in general, I think these settings are going to be a little restrictive. And I think it's important to kind of note before we talk about anybody's specific process, it's always important to remember that what SaberSim is doing is fundamentally very, very different than any other tool out there. What every other tool out there does, every other lineup builder, optimizer, whatever you want to call it does, is it is going to take every player in the slate, right? And it is going to optimize the highest number of total projected points while staying under the salary cap. That's all it's going to do. Well, we know that the highest projected point lineups are not necessarily the highest upside lineups. Those are not the highest expected value lineups if you played the slate out 10,000 times, something like that, right? Traditional tools leave it up to you to program all the rules to basically make it so when the optimizer does the only thing it knows how to do, which is optimizing for average projection, it does so in a way that builds upside alongside that, right? And it's a hard problem to solve. It's very difficult. Well, because we are using and we are leveraging simulations in our tool directly here, we don't have to worry about doing as much of that kind of stuff. And what I specifically mean, right, we are simulating every game out play by play thousands of times. We understand the full range of outcomes of each player playing on the slate. And when you go in and build your lineups, we actually pull from these game simulations in buckets that are sized appropriately for the contest that you're playing. So if you're playing smaller field, single entry kind of contests, we use larger buckets. We capture more of the outcomes. We're a little bit closer to average performance. And when you're playing these larger field contests, like it sounds like that's what Danny is actually playing here, we are going to focus on smaller ranges of outcomes, right? More diversity, more upside. And what that means is that we are capturing a lot of these kind of requirements that have been put in here with filters dynamically in accordance with how often these events happen in the simulation. So I would actually say that I think some of these filters here you can afford to pull back on or even remove. I know removing things out of your process at times can feel a little bit worrisome, right? A little bit concerning, especially if you spent a lot of time kind of researching and coming up with these things. But I actually think especially things like a minimum points, basketball points of 12 and a minimum minutes of 25, I think you're going to find are actually being pretty restrictive. Just as an example on those, right? I wanted to show just for tonight's slate for the value, you can see looking here, right? There are going to be a lot of pretty well projected plays here tonight that are not going to fit in to your filters here, and that's fine potentially, right? But I think that should be a more conscious decision to make intentional fades of some of these players rather than the baseline controls to your player pool. This is actually a slate where we're setting up to have some decent value, at least right off the bat. Slate like last night, slate like yesterday in the middle of the day when we did the show, we ended up with a lot of value throughout the night. But in the middle of the day on a slate where there's just not a lot of value, you'll be stripping off big portions of your player pool. And I think the main point I'm trying to make here is that you lack control over what kind of players show up in your player pool in a traditional optimizer, especially for players that are just projected well point per dollar. The optimizer is going to love those guys. They're going to put 100% of those guys in your lineups. Here, because we're leveraging simulations and only players that have true upside in game simulations are going to be used in your lineups, you don't need to worry about backstopping every single thing. I do think some use of the player filters is a good idea, but I would pull back on this to start with. I probably don't think it's necessary to have a true points filter and a fantasy points filter, because those are pretty directly one-to-one correlated. I would recommend, again, these are just my recommendations. Take any of this as much as you want. I would probably remove the points filter just because I think the minimum projection filter accomplishes that just as well. And I would probably pull back a little on your projections and your minutes. Right. The other thing about the minutes is you're going to lose some players that are projected, that are very good fantasy point per minute players that don't have as much of a minutes projection. Right. So, a lot of bigs, for example, aren't necessarily going to be projected for 25 minutes, but are going to have great projections overall or a great chance for upside. So, something like 18 projected points, 20 minutes, and remove the basketball points filter, I think is a good start here. I would also recommend overall relaxing the utility position selection here. I like to leave all of these open. Again, the main reason why is that because we're leveraging sims here, and I know I'm repeating myself, but I just want to really hammer this point home. You're going to get players in your utility spot and ultimately full lineups that are representative of upside. You'll actually generally see most often that the kinds of players that get thrown into a utility spot are players that have the potential to score points in very diverse ways that are not limited or not dependent on just scoring buckets, right? So a lot of times you will get these guys. Beasley here is kind of just a cheap value play, but like Jokic, Ayton, right? These bigs a lot of times show up in your utility spots here because of the dynamic ways that they can score. Even a guy like Cameron Payne, right? Kind of definitely a lot of assists, right? Even a decent rebounder for a guard, decent steals for his price, can do a lot on the floor without just scoring, right? And those are the kind of guys you get in your utility spots. The other thing that comes up if you limit your lineups by saying only point guards can go in your utility is you hamper your ability to late swap optimally, which is in fact probably the biggest issue I have with this in particular. Is if you say a point guard has to go in your utility spots most often, it means that you're less likely to get a player in the late game into your utility spot, which means your highest leverage point in the lineup, which is the utility, you now no longer necessarily have the ability to, you'll see these guys are all playing in late games, relatively late games. that gives us a lot of late swap flexibility. So I think by setting point guard only in that utility spot, you lose the ability to do that a bit because you've hampered it by a position. I also don't think you really need to. Danny, I know you had mentioned that for this point in particular, you did some of your own research and winning lineups and found that point guards are disproportionately likely to show up in like bank lineups or something like that, or maybe even top 1% or 0.1%. I would be cautious with that kind of research as well. That those kinds of tools, are not always necessarily predictive of how to tackle individual slates, right? Looking back to see what lineup constructions look like on average, or what lineups, what particular players showed up in utility spots in past lineups that just so happened to be successful on that particular night, I think can lead you to seeing patterns where there may not necessarily be one. And I think this is also another thing that's really restrictive. I would even, again, because I know it's hard to sometimes pull back on certain things from your process. One way, if I can, to urge you in a new direction for this particular thing would be, instead of setting a rule ahead of time to force the builder to follow this, I would run builds with this less restrictive here and see if you can make adjustments to your utility spots in the exposure setting here in step 3, right? On a night like tonight, for example, you would miss completely that there's clearly a lot of viable lineups with Jokic and 8 in utility by setting that rule, right? And maybe you end up deciding that you want to play just centers in your utility spot, right? Well, now we can do that by kind of doing a little bit of post-build management of your pool instead of pre-build rules. So kind of 2 common trends there, I guess, to start is I would open these rules up a little bit more, give the builder a little bit more room to work, because SaberSim can be trusted a little bit more than other tools. I wanted to touch on the last little bit here. I noticed, or not the last little bit I noticed, the last little bit of this comment here, which I think is a little bit more on the contest selection thing, and then we'll move on. So it said, I'm looking for some pointers on how to get more consistent on my winnings and placings so I can take the current winnings that I have and be confident entering the 150 max $15 games without losing it all, since it seems to be hit or miss on the bets. I'm aiming to move into 20 max games to figure out good filters, but whenever I play with these current settings, I never win on 20 entry max games. I feel like the more entries gives the simulator all of the advantages, and that's why I win sometimes. Just looking for any thoughts or suggestions to expand into 20 max consistencies for now. I imagine if you land on first place in a 20 entry game, you'd still place well against 150. Any tips or suggestions are appreciated. So, okay. So a couple thoughts on this here right off the bat. First of all, be cautious with that jump. The flagship, the 150 max $15 is a tough contest to win. JDS Dog, who I know actually responded to you in Slack, has done a pretty cool simulation of this on Twitter. You need approximately a $400,000 bankroll to survive maxing the 150 max $15 every single night on DraftKings and reduce your chance of going completely broke to 5% or less, right? So actually, let me put it another way. To reduce your chance of going completely broke to 5% or less in the 150 max $15, you need a $400,000 bankroll at the start of the season. That might be where you stand, and that's great. But I think people assume that jump, that to make that jump safely to maxing that contest out on a nightly basis is smaller than it is. It is a significant jump. It is a much further jump. For example, the mini max, to be successful in the mini max over the course of a season, right? Which is only 30 times smaller than the entry fee of the mini max is 30 times smaller than the $15. Right? You need about a $1,500 bankroll to survive that. Much, much smaller and much, much smaller than the 30 times difference in the entry fees, right? The difference in what you need to survive those 2 contests is much bigger than people think. So I would approach with caution there, right? If you were having a lot of success in the contest that you were playing now, I would, maybe slowly move up a little bit more in stakes as you're ready, but be careful with a big jump to that big top-heavy flagship contest, because it's tough to be profitable in that over the long term, and there's a ton of variance in it overall. But overall, I think you have the right approach here, and it sounds like you are having some success already. which is great. I think you will find that you actually open up more options to be successful, especially if you are in the interest of playing more lineups, right? Which it kind of sounds like you are. If you're going to start adding in additional contests and playing more lineups, these really restrictive rules are going to force you into playing lower expected value lineups more quickly because there aren't always a lot of positive expected value lineups that fit within these rules. So when you're building 20 or even 150 lineups on a 9-game NBA slate with only point guard and utility, restrict the player pool in this way, etc., it's probably still likely that the builder is able to find you positive expected value lineups that fit those rules, right? They are lineups that you may have had anyway. If you start playing more and more lineups, playing higher and higher stakes, that margin is going to get thinner of how many successful lineups can be found within these rules. So at that point, I would kind of think about maybe relaxing some of these. So let me know if that helps. Again, I think that the spirit of my response here, or what I kind of think is, I'm glad you're having success. I think it's great that you've identified a few opportunities to add value in terms of setting build rules and restricting your player pool or filtering your player pool. But I would actually relax them a little bit, pull back on them a little bit, and let the builder work a little more. So anyway, great. Cool. For now, let's move on. Okay. I see a ton of questions. That's awesome. We will get to everything, I promise. For now, we're going to track through the questions that came in the Office Hours channel in Slack in about the order that they came in. So first of all, before we jump into these, before we go much further, there's a link to join the Slack community in the description of every past Office Hours video. If you've watched these streams before, you'll notice I answer the questions that come in Slack first. I highly recommend joining up in Slack. There's great conversation going on there every single day, and you get an opportunity to get your questions answered earlier in the stream because that is typically where I like to start. So let's do this here. Question from JSJR. And this question says, what's considered value in NBA DFS? Is it a player that's 5K who's getting 30 minutes, or is it a player that's 3K that gets to start? The lame answer, the strictly speaking answer here is that value is the player's projection divided by the salary times 1,000, right? Like I don't think for like this question, I think is a little bit semantical. I don't think there's one of these that qualifies as value and one of them that doesn't, right? I mean, their value can be kind of diverse. I think you will see in general that lower salary players are going to be the more likely value plays on a given slate. You are rarely going to see a 10x player. You're probably never going to see a 10x player that has a 7.92x value. These questions about value overall, when we're talking about NBA, I think the most interesting story to tell, or the most interesting way to answer these, is just to remember that this is not the end all be all. The value column sorted top to bottom is not a list of the overall best possible plays or the overall list of top exposures you would want necessarily in your lineups, right? Raw points have value. I guess that's maybe a little bit of a confusing way to say that because we're talking about value. Raw points are important, right? There is something that is inherently valuable about Giannis's 58 points, even if you're only getting 4.7 points per dollar. So like with that, these two examples in the question, the point per dollar value player may be the 3K player that's starting that has no usage, even though the 5K player that, plays his typical role in the offense may actually be the more valuable player in your lineup. So all of this to say, I think on a practical level, instead of trying to do your research by looking at the value column and trying to dissect a slate that way, I highly recommend playing with the test builds, right? I think that's one of the most useful things about the test build is it will tell you a story about the best overall plays for your particular contest to play in a way that is lineup focused and is focused on upside, right? This tells you a little bit of a story, right? The two overall. So yes, Malik Beasley, the top overall value play on the slate, is a great play, but by far the two most efficient, well, actually Jokic is by far the most efficient player to use at this particular point for a 20 max 10 to 50K, right? And that would not be implied by the value here. Scotty Barnes is a fantastic play at 6,300. That's not implied by the 5.69 value, So I would approach with caution with diving in too deep with just the value column alone. I know Kurt's probably pulling his hair out, our value guy in the Slack chat, but yeah, I would highly recommend using the test build as opposed to doing all of your research with the value column. So, okay, cool. Let's keep it going. A couple of questions in Slack today here that have some lengthy comment chains attached to them. So I didn't have time to read all of these comment chains, so I will be kind of tackling these here as best I can with just the information that's in the original question. So this one is from Tone. He said, we've gone over many times on stream how research builds in certain sports can be a useful tool to determine a player's optimal percentage. I was wondering if you had any ideas and ways to use the tool where we could approximate a player's boom and bust percentage in an easy, visible manner. The way the research builds make it easy to visualize an approximate optimal percentage. I think we can kind of see this by clicking on the range of outcomes, but that can be tedious to do for multiple players. Any ideas? Honestly, the research build essentially is that tool. That essentially is what the research build is doing. I know different tools out there have the boom or bust kind of calculations. Different competitors may assign boom differently, right? In one case, what the research build is really doing is it's saying what's the percent chance of that player to be in the optimal, which is one way to calculate that, right? I think there's alternatives to this. I actually think a lot of what you see elsewhere in the industry in terms of boom percentages and bust percentages, frankly, isn't actually that great, mostly because all they are doing is they are taking a historical standard deviation, assuming a player has a normal distribution, and basically taking they're basically backing out a percentile and saying what, actually, no, they're not backing out a percentile. They're using some kind of target score calculation and saying a player's boom is 5x plus 10 and seeing if they assume a totally normal distribution, what the percentage of the time the player hits that is. That's what you typically get. And vice versa on the bust, right? They'll say a bust is, I don't know, 4x minus 10 or something like that of their salary. And they'll kind of calculate that assuming a normal distribution. In NBA, you could do worse than that, right? Nikola Jokic's distribution looks pretty normal, actually. A lot of NBA players have more normal distributions. This doesn't work too bad in NBA, right? Not exactly a normal distribution here. In other sports, there are going to be big issues with going that route. One sec. Oh, needed a water break there. So anyway, the research build, I think, is going to give you a pretty good idea of the overall that similar kind of calculation. I think it's going to do it in a way, since we're pulling from simulations, that's a little bit more sophisticated anyway. I think an alternative to that is kind of using the percentiles. And I know this isn't, percentiles are kind of almost the inverse of the boom and bust percentages, right? Instead of saying, here's the percentage of hitting a certain target score, it's saying, here's the exact target score that is hit a certain percentage of the time. But I think they can still be a pretty good tool for downside or upside, right? Either way, right? I mean, if you were trying to look, right, like a player, Malik Beasley's interesting, right? So his bust, his floor, 25th percentile, right, meets or exceeds at least 75% of the time is 19 points, which is about 6x of his salary anyway. So you can kind of see quickly that this is relatively safe value, right? And I think you can do this when looking at salary bands or projected bands and kind of identify outliers on both the upside potential and the downside potential pretty quickly. So I know that's not like perfectly helpful. I hope that's mostly helpful. I think the tools that we have here can kind of accomplish similar goals here to what you may see elsewhere in the form of the research build and the percentiles. And I would really strongly approach with caution on those kinds of boom and bust tools on other sites. Not to say they are invaluable, right? Especially in NBA, I think they can provide a lot of usefulness. But to just be careful, because the assumptions that are being used there are often going to assume things, mostly that there's a normal distribution, I guess there's two things that I would that give me pause about some of those other tools. One is the assumption that all players are normally distributed in their distributions, which is how these are often calculated. And the second is however that target score of whatever boom or smash or any of that actually means is calculated, right? I don't like 5x plus 10 as a way of determining whether a player is a good play, right, in a vacuum, right? I don't like that. I think there's a few problems with that. One of the biggest problems with that overall is it doesn't deal with the problem of positional scarcity at all, right? Picking a player in a vacuum and saying that this player has a 40% chance to hit some arbitrary target score really tells you nothing about the DFS strategy on that slate unless they're also telling you how that player fits into the overall player pool, right? That sounds like a pretty good a player that has a 40% chance to boom sounds pretty good if the next best player at that same position has a 5% chance to do that. But if every other player in the pool has a 30% plus chance to have that score, then how valuable is that? And I think that's one of the other issues with this kind of thing as well. That's actually one of the things that is the most nice about the research build is that because it's building lineups to do it, it accounts for positional scarcity, right? Because we're actually using optimal lineups from sets of sims, a very well projected player is not described in a research build in a vacuum. If there are other very well projected players at the similar position, they will show up appropriately for that condition, right? Like tonight's actually an interesting example where a lot of our value, almost all of our value is at shooting guard, is that guard or center, right? Like those are kind of where the value is here at the moment. If you ran a research build, you might actually find that some of the ownership projections for some of these players are a little bit, these players are actually showing up less optimal than their ownership projection indicates because there's a lot of them, right? I mean, there are three guards in the top 5 overall value plays, and that doesn't even say anything about all of the pay up options at guard that always have a very high chance to show up in the optimal. So the percent chance that like Malik Beasley is actually the optimal shooting guard or the optimal point guard or the optimal guard right now is probably lower than you would kind of think. Anyway, I feel like I'm kind of ranting about this particular thing right now. For now, I would say practical side of this is I would stick with running the research builds. I think they're frankly better than these boom bust kinds of tools. But if there's a limitation here or something like that, I'd be happy to kind of talk about that a little bit more. But so, okay, cool. And then I'm going to jump over to this question here. Okay, so this one, it looks like is kind of a reply to something else that I haven't read. So I'm going to do my best with this, but this is from Epic Problem. He said, I was wondering what the builder's threshold is for late swapping in value. I have certainly seen lineups where at every late swap junction, one position in, say, a late game is waffling back and forth between two players. Is 0.01 value enough to judge the builder to the better value? If the trigger point is that acute, would there be some usefulness in allowing this to be configurable threshold on late swaps? That configurable threshold is actually your sim variance slider. So what's actually happening here, right? We don't care about the average projection when you're late swapping at all. If you're seeing this, and I've seen this too, where you have one position left in a lineup available, and every time you rebuild the late swap, it's kind of going back and forth between two players. All that means is that every time we late swap that lineup, you're getting alternating simulations where one player outperforms the other, right? You have two, you're swapping between, this is totally hypothetical, you're swapping between Trae Young and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, right? Every single time, those two go back and forth, right? In this case, they have identical values, but they're slightly different projections, right? Well, all that's happening there is in one set of simulations, you get one where Shai outscores Trae. The other one, you get a simulation where Trae outscores Shai. I think it's Shai, actually, but the rhyming is kind of fun here. So that is going to introduce some natural variance into your overall lineup. If you want to turn that down, right? If you want to decrease the effect of that, you want to value average projections more, the easiest thing to do is to turn your sim variance down, right? That is going to mean that the bucket of simulations used to build your late swap lineups are going to be bigger. And the overall impact of that is that we're going to stick a little bit closer to the average projection when we build your lineups. So I think there's actually an argument to be made to turn down your sim variance slider a little bit as the slate goes on, especially if you're performing well, and especially if big news breaks. Yesterday, when the Yurt 7 news came out, I turned down my sim variance a little bit from where I started at the build, just because I didn't want variance to get in the way of me getting as much Yurt 7 as I could. That obviously didn't pay off very well. I think we'll actually end up talking about that here in a bit. But I didn't want out of pure variance to get less Yurt 7 than I could afford to pack into my lineup. So I turned it down a little bit because I just wanted that elite play into my lineups. So if you want that, or if you want to decrease the overall change to your lineups each time you are late swapping, turn down your sim variance slider. But be aware that you are also probably, you are lowering the overall diversity of your lineups. You may also be decreasing the volatility of your lineups. You're going to be playing lineups that are going to be projected to do a little bit more on average, but may possess a little bit less overall upside. So, cool. Let me know if that helps. Okay. Another good question here. This is from Reed. And he said, when I unique rank my lineups, 2020, 2020, for example, it invariably has many more players in the fourth set of 20 and the least in the first 20. It is an exact sliding scale. The question is that by design? I would imagine 80 lineups with the same risk profile would have the same number of players. No, that is basically to be expected, right? If you have a smaller set of lineups, by percentage, right? Strictly by percentage, there are more lineups that will include the best plays, right? If you have 20 lineups, it is easier to include the best overall plays on the slate in 100% of them than it is if you have 200 lineups, because there's a finite amount of possible lineups you can make for a given slate. You can actually just see this, right? Like, as we increase the lineups in your pool, watch your exposures, right? So watch the top exposures of these guys as we increase, right? 40, 60, 80, right? As Jokic and Beasley's and Scotty Barnes and these other guys' exposures are going down as we increase the size of the pool, that is basically saying that the lineups at the end of this list have less by percentage exposure to those players than the first 20. It is not necessarily true that there's a flat exposure. If you are playing 100 lineups and you have a certain amount of average exposure to a particular player in the pool, there's no reason to necessarily believe that if you take a random subset of lineups, whether they are the first 20 lineups in the pool or any 20, that they're going to match evenly throughout, right? Your actual exposure. And the best overall plays are likely to be overall concentrated at the higher saver score lineups at the top. Shady Advice, I saw, responded to this as well. I think he provided a little bit more color. One of his points that I think is a very sound point. If you want to avoid this, if you don't like this, use the unique random fill instead of the unique rank, right? That will basically make it a little bit more likely that any given contest out of your portfolio of contests for that given night matches your overall lineup exposures a little bit more, right? Especially, I think the more you are spending time editing exposures, the more you are probably justified in using unique random fill. Because if you've taken the time to craft your exposures and got everything exactly where you want, you probably want something resembling that overall set of exposures across all of your different contests. And the easiest way to do that is to fill them randomly in. If you fill them with rank, you are going to be disproportionately more likely to favor what SaberSim believes to be the best plays in those top lineups. You might have 100% exposure in 20 lineups to a player that you only have 60% exposure to in 100. So, but really good question there about kind of the nuance of some of these entry fill types. So, and then a question from Dallas here about core plays. He says, if you're signed up through Run Pure, you have the core plays header with the stars for those plays. Can you make this available for us to do for ourselves? Say I have 10 guys I want to be overweight on. It would be much easier to sort by my core plays than typing the name to find their current exposure. I don't think we are going to add the exact core star things like we've seen elsewhere. You can make a group. So you can essentially get the builder functionality here. So if you had 10 plays that you wanted to be overweight on, and wanted to make sure that you were like including them into a particular group or something like that, or making sure that you had a certain amount of them in each lineup, I would make a group here. So you could say, let's say hypothetically 1 through there you go. Right? Maybe these 9 and say at least 3, right? That will make sure that you are essentially overweight on this pool overall. I guess it's actually an interesting idea here to give you the ability to kind of like star players. People have asked for something like that before, of kind of starring players overall and like giving them a bump to the exposure. I think that's interesting. What we do want to do, I guess I will say, we do want to give people the ability to add players to a group from here or from step 1, or basically anytime you see a player name to be able to add them to the group from there. And I do think the idea of showing when a player is in a group would be also interesting to sort by. So maybe those are actually, I think that's kind of an interesting idea. I will say, just to be like totally transparent here, that's not something we had kind of talked about doing beforehand. I think it's an interesting idea. I would like to be able to tell you that that's in the works. But we do want to add the ability to add to group from anywhere you see a player name. So, but okay, a couple questions. JDS Dog had asked about the PGA model. I gave kind of a brief explanation of what the golf model looks like last week. So I popped a link into Slack if anybody wants to go see that. And there was another question from Reed here about ROI, expected ROI here. These are always tough questions to answer because ROI is very finicky in GPPs. He said, you mentioned before the EV of the best cash players, 5% or so, I think. What's the EV of the best GPP players over time? Again, measuring anything, I guess EV is a different discussion because it would theoretically be separate from actual results if you could calculate it that way. I think I want to be careful with my answer here. I think 10 to 20% ROIs in GPPs in the right sports for skilled players is definitely reasonable. I know some of the most elite players in specific sports, experts in particular sports, can probably manage a 30% ROI in specific sports over the long term. I think those are realistic numbers. I think my NBA ROI for this season is floating somewhere around 10 to 15%. Which again is kind of finicky based on the size of that sample. If I finish, I've taken second in a couple tournaments this season. If I take first, that ROI is significantly higher on basically a random event. But I think those are kind of at least realistic numbers to kick around here. Okay, cool. And then a question from James here. That will hit. And this is the last question that came in Slack before the start of the stream. So after this question, we'll jump over to YouTube chat and get caught up there. James said, hi, Jordan. Do you think I will be too aggressive on a 9-game slate if my slider settings for ownership are for 4 ownership fade and 6 for my sim variance, still learning the tools with SaberSim? No, I think those are perfect. That obviously depends on the size of the contest, but I think those are... No, I think that's fine. 4 and 6, right? Those are going to be approximately defaults for like a 20 max, 10 to 50K for tonight's slate. A little bit higher on ownership fade than the default value, but nothing wrong with that. No, I think those are perfectly fine. I have no problem with that. The defaults, again, for those of you that don't know, these default sliders that show up when you set your contests here have been back tested for that particular contest by building thousands of lineups at every single slider combination and computing what the highest expected value is for each of them. So when we set them here, we believe that those are actually the optimal sliders. Now, if you want to play a little more risky with your ownership fade and tick this up one notch, that's perfectly fine. But the defaults are a very good baseline for what's appropriate for a particular contest. So saw this. Brad said, "What's EV?" It means expected value. In other words, it's your expected return if the slate were to be played out, or whatever sample, whatever you're looking at. If in this particular case, generally the slate were to be played out a large number of times, 100,000 times. I think mathematically if the slate were to be played out an infinite number of times, what is the average return in that set? So it basically, it gives you a tool to determine. You can't determine if a lineup is theoretically profitable after one slate. You certainly can't after 10. You can't after 20. You probably can't after 100. As that number gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, then you get a little bit more of a reason to confidently state whether that lineup's profitable or not. So when we're talking about like the ROIs from this last question, we're talking about is expected ROI, right? Like what a player, if a player with a 30% expected ROI invests $100,000 in entry fees, they would expect to profit by the end of the season $30,000. But that is only true some of the time. There is a range of outcomes there for what is actually going to happen. So that's what I'm referring to there. But when you hear about EV and DFS spaces, often you'll often hear about it as plus EV or minus EV. And what people are saying, if they say something is plus EV, is that doing that thing or incorporating that into your process or playing that player or playing that lineup is going to lead to profit if we were able to re-simulate or rerun this exact situation 10,000 times. Positive EV decisions can still lose on a small sample size, and negative EV decisions can still win on a small sample size. So anyway. Okay. Question from Scott. This came in at the start of the stream. Scott, if you're still around, thanks for being patient. He said, when there's insane value, 7x or more on a slate, what's the max exposure you set in the system? I don't really touch max exposures at all. I will go heavy on a player happily. If the slate is right, if the situation's right, and I will also be diversified if the slate is right. So I typically don't end up setting max exposure. I think one of the things that, in general to be cautious of if you're doing this is that, there's definitely a contest component to this, right? Where being 100% exposed to a player is going to mean something very different if you're playing 3 lineups versus 20 versus 150. You can actually see that, right? The builder understands that dynamically. If you tell the builder, give me 20 lineups, it says, okay, here's Jokic, right? 100%. If you say, give me 150, then you have 75% exposure to Jokic, right? So there's a kind of a native understanding of this in the tool regardless. But for me personally, I don't set max exposures. I let this kind of come to me naturally with the default settings and what the context of the slate looks like. You will see that this kind of operates as you would hope it would. In other words, higher variance, more volatile players are going to be, even if they are projected very well on average, you are going to get less exposure to them. You can see this especially sport to sport. In NBA, you can expect to have some of your highest exposures overall for sports with a similar slate size and player pool. If you go to a 9-game slate for NHL and build 500 lineups and ask for 150, I think seeing this level of exposure to any one player is probably a little less likely because there's much higher variance in NHL. So anyway, I will. There have been slates this week where I've been 100% exposed to players. There have been, as my maximum, there have been slates this week alone where my maximum exposure in NBA is 50%. And I typically allow that to come to me as opposed to setting that as a rule. So, And then another question here on a regular slate, if someone is under 6x value and the system automatically assigns them to 100% of my lineups, what's the max you would set to exposures to control that? 2x the field. Yeah. So again, for me personally, I'm unconcerned with that, right? Like a guy like Jokic, yeah, he's under 6x value, but his average projection is 66 fantasy points, right? He is probably, this is his average, not his median. But I mean, it is probably safe to assume that about 50% of the time or more, he is going to score 65 fantasy points, right? Now, there is a value to overall raw fantasy point production that traditional value does not describe, because you can only roster 8 guys. So being able to get 66 points or 70 points into one roster spot is more valuable than the point per dollar value describes. So again, I am not afraid of this in particular for elite expensive values, right? Actually, in reality, 5.22 fantasy points per dollar for a 12-6 player is spectacular. That's why he's showing up in so many lineups. With that said, there is nothing wrong with diversifying and managing your risk. And that's going to be a little bit of a personal, each player is going to handle that question differently. If you want to still allow the Sims to kind of be valuable to you and add value to your process here, but also diversify a little bit more, I think 2x the field is a great starting point, right? If you're looking at this and you're thinking, I'm not willing to let 75% of my 150 lineups go down with the ship in the event that Jokic is not in the winning lineup or optimal or even has a good night, 2x the field, I think, is still a great way to go. You're still getting value. You're still getting leverage over the field on that particular player, but you've diversified quite a bit. And you can do this as you go down too, right? Like, we could do this with other guys as well. And you'll see, as you do this, even for just a couple players at the top, you end up naturally with a much more flatter exposures, a much more diversified set of kind of assets basically in this lineup portfolio, which for some people, you're going to feel a lot more comfortable with that. So nothing wrong with that. But Brad said, how do you feel in the showdown tonight with the 76ers? Think the sim has a good enough measure on the team yet? I know we had talked a little bit about this with the Nets last night. I'm still like, first of all, partly because like I don't personally have the time investment to be able to go into every single game here and on individual showdowns, like tweak and research and do things here. So I've been kind of just riding with what the Sims are saying. I do think the Sixers are playing a little bit more of a consistent rotation than the Nets are right now. So I feel a little bit more comfortable with what the Sims are saying that the Sixers look like than the Nets, mostly because Durant just came back last night, right? That was the big uncertainty piece there. With the Sixers, I mean, there's not a huge data set here, but we've at least seen this team play with Harden and Embiid together a handful of games here now. I feel a little bit more comfortable with where things are probably projected. On main slates, most of the Sixers are still overpriced, right? These prices on DraftKings aren't sustainable for these two guys. I don't think they're going to have to come down before they can really be too playable again. They make for interesting leverage opportunities because they both have 70-point upside very easily. But anyway, short answer, one, I don't want to give the indication that I'm spending time going in here and doing that kind of research on a team-by-team basis. I think if you are identifying teams that are inherently more difficult to project and using that as an opportunity to do some research, I think that's great. But I ran the Nets last night with default projections, just to be transparent. With that said, I think the Sixers are a little bit more projectable than the Nets are at the moment. So, cool. Let's keep it going. Freddie said, hello, Jordan. What's the best way to stack teams? Interesting question. So I'm going to start kind of from the beginning here and say that even in sports that have higher correlation, right? Let's go to a sport like NHL. And actually, let's do, it would be more fun? Because I know the NHL builder takes a little while to build lineups. That's something that we want to improve. Let's go to League of Legends, right? Let's look at a high correlation sport like League, just to give an opportunity to show off our League sim. So what what SaberSim does that's very different to other tools out there, right? Is that because I've said this a couple times today on the stream. So those of you that have been here the whole time, stay with me. But we're simulating out games even in a sport like League, right? And because we're simulating out games, we can pull from those simulations and build lineups that are optimal for sets of simulations so that you naturally get the kind of lineup constructions that make sense for that particular contest. So if you're unfamiliar with League, if you've never played this before, it stacks very similarly to a sport like baseball. Very high correlation sport. You can actually see the correlations for these guys are some of the biggest correlations you're going to see in any sport, right? It basically is very efficient to stack up teams, right? So how do we do that? What's the best way to stack teams? With SaberSim, you typically don't have to do anything, right? We can go in here, just say purely what contest we're playing. Let's say we're playing a 20 max. Contests in League are a little bit smaller. And it'll say, okay, use these settings for correlation, ownership, and variance. And when we build this, we're naturally going to get stacks without setting a single rule. And I used League here as an example because it is a very high correlation sport where the correlation values are very high. But this is true of all sports that we offer. So in NBA, you're probably not going to get a ton of game stacks, right? There aren't a lot of very high positive correlations in NBA. The biggest correlations that we want to think about in NBA are negative correlations. So you typically want to avoid overly stacking up one team because most of the players on the same team are somewhat negatively correlated. In baseball, you'll get big, nice stacks here. So you can see 4-3, right out of the gate in 100% of our lineups without setting a rule. Hockey, similar deal, right? High correlation sport. In hockey, there's a lot of different game stack. There are a lot of different types of stacks. Since you're stacking lines instead of teams as much, sometimes it can make sense to stack two different lines from the same team. Sometimes it doesn't. So if you run hockey lineups, again, without setting any rules, you will get a good start to what your stack should look like. Let's run a hockey build here real quick and just see if it will play nice with us and build pretty quickly. It doesn't take too long if you're actually building your hockey lineups, but on stream, this can be a little bit boring to watch, but yeah, it's not too bad. Let's build some hockey lineups and see what this comes out as. So again, the answer here really is that, or the short answer is that you don't really have to go in and set stacking rules using SaberSim for different teams because we have an understanding of what the correlations look like for particular sports, and we'll build lineups that naturally have those kinds of stacks in them. So let's look at these hockey stacks real quick. And then I will show you, because I also want to show you, if you have an opinion about what kinds of stacks you want. So similar deal here, right? A couple stacks here where we're getting like multiple players from multiple skaters from different lines on the same team, but a lot of these nice 4-3, 4-2-2 kind of natural stacks in hockey. With all of that said, let's say for hockey, for example, that you knew that you wanted to stack two different even strength lines in every single lineup, you can still set a rule to do that. So if you go into the build settings and click rules, there'll be a stacking tab here, right? And you can click to add a stacking rule. So the way this works basically is you can say, what's the logic of the rule? At least or no more than a certain number of players. You set the number of players here. So at least 3 players, and then you stack from what parameter here in this part. So from the same team, from the same game, right? Same team is kind of more of maybe like a baseball or a football kind of stack. Same game is I think probably very much a football kind of stack where both sides of the both teams in the game typically are positively correlated to one another. Right? So you want those like run backs. But hockey, we have these unique line stacks. So you could do at least 3 from the same even strength line. If you wanted to do that for 2 different stacks, you could do that here. So all sports are the same for SaberSim in that way. We have an understanding of the correlation by default. You do not have to set stacking rules for any sport with SaberSim, but you have the ability to add rules if you want to add a little bit more control to your process. So. Okay, jumping back to Slack here. Looks like I covered a couple of these here already. So let's grab this one. And see where we're at. When doing 20 max entries for large field GPPs and small GPPs, do you think it's a good idea to change the player's max exposure to the field for my highest exposure players? I don't really touch my uniques. I leave it at 1. I think I answered this question, James. I think I actually covered this question a couple days ago. I remember you asking this one already. I'll kind of quickly answer this again. So editing your maximum exposure to match the projected ownership exactly is going to lower your ownership edge that you get, right? Like the idea of having ownership fade on as a slider here, right, is basically saying that the field's ownership is inefficient, that they're going to make mistakes. They're going to roster some players too much and other players not enough. So you want to be higher or lower than the field on certain players. With that said, there are sports like NASCAR, I think is a really good example, where there is such a big edge in roster construction, in your lineup construction, that you don't need ownership leverage as much. And in that case, maybe it makes more sense to get closer to the field to reduce your risk. But I would say in general, I don't think I would be cautious with this. I think if you want to diversify, instead of matching the field exactly on a bunch of players, set kind of a limit of on players that you want to be heavier on, only go 2x the field, and on players that you want to go lighter on, go 1/2 the field. You can't do that on every single player in the slate, right? There's too many players in the player pool to do that. But even actually just doing that at the high end and saying you're only maximally going to go 2x the field on any given player, I think is a good way to kind of diversify while still giving yourself an opportunity to get an ownership edge. So, and then on the min uniques, again, this is one that I covered this the last time this question came in, but I don't really touch this too often. I think it's kind of just a blunt tool to increase diversity in your lineups. I think if you want more diversity, you are better off increasing the sim variance slider. That's going to increase the diversity of your lineups by widening the range of outcomes used for any given lineup, which is a more natural, a more upside-focused way of diversifying. This purely just restricts the builder and forces the builder to follow a certain kind of rule. So, but, yeah, so. Okay. All right. Couple other questions in Slack here. I did see this, Brad. I actually just chatted about this 76ers projections and Sims question, probably just 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago or so. So if you want to rewind, watch that again, check that out. If you can't find it, when I post this as a recording on YouTube, I always timestamp the video. So it'll be timestamped to exactly when I talk about that. But I don't want to repeat that one right now because we have a lot of other questions in our queue here. So this is from Larson in Slack. In huge field football tournaments, I usually leave 500 at least on the table. What's the standard you would want on the system to leave in a 10K person tournament in NBA? I wouldn't, for like main slates, for typical main slates, I wouldn't intentionally leave salary on the table for basketball. Salaries in basketball are pretty well correlated to fantasy point production. Overall, a lot of the most efficient, the highest expected value lineups in the pool are going to be built at the maximum salaries, 49.5 and up. And secondly, the main reason why lowering your maximum salary is efficient sometimes is to avoid duplication. Your raw risk of being duplicated in a 9-game NBA slate, assuming you are doing the other parts of your process the right way, like looking at ownership and playing a diversified portfolio of lineups, which will happen automatically if you're building with SaberSim, your odds of being duplicated are just very, very low in an NBA main slate in a 50,000 person lineup contest compared to something like NFL Showdown or MMA contests or even golf contests or enormous field NFL main slate lineups, right? Your odds of being duplicated here are pretty low. So I don't think there's a big, I think you're going to sacrifice too many good lineups for very little gain by capping your maximum salary in NBA Classic. So. Okay, and then another question here. Let's hit this one real quick. This one says, last night I had a 3 max win with 385 in the main slate. I also ran the sim for 20 max, but never got the same lineup in the 20 max. My top score in the 20 max was 377.5. If it's one of the top 3 lineups, shouldn't it have shown up in the 20 max build as well? Not necessarily. I mean, there's a couple things that can happen here. First of all, there is natural variance and diversity in the set of sims that are going to be chosen for each individual lineup. I mean, you can actually see, even if you do a 3 max build, and for example, pick a contest drop down like this, and just run build after build after build after build, you will probably see a similar kind of set of players showing up in your lineups. But because the sim variance slider is going to select for different simulations each time it builds a lineup, you may not get the same number of the same exact lineups every single time. That's a good thing. That means the builder is picking up on the natural variance that exists in the game. Any optimizer that gives you the identical set of lineups every single time you build lineups is overvaluing the expected value of those lineups. It is assuming that those lineups are far better than they actually are. The other reason on a more practical level that this is a good thing is it means it's very hard to duplicate other SaberSim users, right? Just as you are likely to get different lineups if you run consecutive builds, so is everybody else. So that's probably the most likely thing that's going on here, is just naturally, it's not even a matter of the 3 max versus the 20 max. It's that purely based on the variance of the simulations alone that you are just getting different lineups in between your builds. With that said, it is on the other side, it is of course possible that you can get the same lineup showing up in different builds. So if you built your 3 maxes, a common question I get on the other side of this sometimes is, I did my single entries, then I did my 3 max build, then I did my 20 max build, and then I did my 150 max build, and I had 5 of the same lineups in my 20 max and my 150, and one of those lineups was also in my single entry. Why did I dupe myself? Well, there is also the potential that you could get the exact same lineup from a different set of simulations in between builds. That can happen. So that I think is probably the simplest answer for maybe what went on here. I mean, there are a couple other things that pop into my mind. If these weren't run at the exact same time, right? If the projections and simulations updated in between these 2 builds, then everything can change, right? Because then the projections are totally different. The last note I would make on this is that because 3 max sliders are going to have a lower ownership fade and they're going to have lower variance, they are likely to have higher average projections on the individual lineup level than 20 max builds, right? In a 20 max build, you have to sacrifice more average projection to fade some additional ownership and to get higher variance lineups, because you are competing against a bigger and more diverse field. So what that actually means in practice is that the lineups you build using a 3 max build are likely on average to score more than the lineups that you are getting on a 20 max build. The upside potential of those lineups is a different story entirely, but purely based on the average projections, it is safe to assume that if you could simulate a slate out 10,000 times, that the lineups that were produced from a 3 max build will perform better on average than the lineups on a 20 max build. That does not mean the lineups that are built on a 3 max build are better, for the same reason that playing cash lineups in GPPs is not better than playing good high upside lineups. But that's just another kind of note to think about. So, okay. And then a question from Edward. This is the last one in Slack, and then we'll jump back. I see a couple other questions trickled in YouTube. So we'll get to those here. This one says, I usually play the 25 cent and the $1 20 max contests each day. Would you suggest building 40 lineups so that I have unique lineups in all lineups? Same basic questions on 3 max and single entry. So if I have a total of 10 lineups to fill, would you do the settings for the 3 max in the Sims and just have it build 10 lineups? If so, how does this strategy impact what late swap will do? What I'm wondering is, will the late swap make all of these lineups more uniform as the late swap is applied? Okay. Interesting question here. In general, I would say yes. I would use unique lineups for these, but you have to understand that you are accepting the risk that your best lineup ends up in a lower dollar contest, right? Your best lineup could end up in the quarter jukebox instead of the and one, which is unfortunate, but you're still potentially win that contest. The reason why I think this is a good strategy is because it's going to smooth out your variance. It's going to give you more overall shots. It's going to give you double the shots at having a high upside lineup. And even if you don't win back all of the equity you could have by banking the and one, you win back some of it, allowing you to reinvest that more quickly, right? Not banking the and one for $2,000 or $3,000 or whatever it is, and instead winning the quarter jukebox for $500 is a little bit unfortunate, but you get the opportunity to reinvest that $500 immediately the next day, and you may not have had that lineup at all if you didn't play 40 lineups. So I would say in this particular case, I would probably use a unique fill. With that said, two things. First of all, there's a limit to this, right? If the difference between these two contests was not winning $500 and winning $2,000, but winning $500 and winning $200,000, I would not be willing to leave that up to pure chance. In that case, I would probably just play the same set of 20 in both, because I personally couldn't live with that if I lost out on that difference in stakes because of pure randomness. Second, that answer is not necessarily going to be true for everyone, right? That is what I would recommend on average, because it's going to smooth out your variance and give you a better shot at reinvestment more quickly. But you might say, I'm okay taking on the additional risk and assuming a little bit of additional variance here. I'm going to play the same 20 in both. I'd rather win both and lose the ability to play an additional 20 lineups. So for single entry and three maxes, I think it almost always makes sense to play a unique lineup into everything, unless there's, again, a significant difference in stakes, right? But because of the way that the single entry and three max contests are actually organized on the lobby, what you will see is that there is typically the prize pools, at least up to like $100, aren't like spectacularly different. So if we do single entry, for example, oh God, I hate this tooltip. It's okay. It's so hard to get rid of sometimes when it pops up. So there's a difference in prize pools for single entry contests as you move up and down in stakes is a little bit smaller than it is for like large field multi-entry stuff. So I think for single entries, I think for the most part, you might as well just fill these uniquely, right? Like, again, yes, there's a difference between a $10,000 and a $25,000 prize pool, but I don't think you need to go out and win every single entry with one single lineup on a given night, right? You might as well win back some of that equity a little more quickly. So that's what I would do. But okay, cool. Brad said, SaberSim refreshes every few minutes, correct? When it doesn't automatic refresh, would it change any of my lineups I have already ran? So when sims run, it's not necessarily every few minutes. As we approach lock and like after lock, it's pretty fast. It's about as often as news breaks. Like we'll typically run new simulations the moment news breaks, like within a few seconds, and have that sim done pretty quick. At this time of day, there can sometimes be news that breaks that doesn't get updated with a new sim for an hour, because it doesn't really matter to have that process running every second all day. But it's pretty quick. So, but specifically, when it does an automatic refresh, would it change any of my lines that I've already ran? We will resort an existing build to match what the new projections are every time you return to it. If you want to see what your lineups looked like before, your lineup sets are saved. They will typically save automatically for you. You can also save them yourself. So for example, right, you can actually kind of see the different lineup sets that we've played with throughout this stream. So if I go back to the very first lineup set we had at the start of the stream, you can see here, this is the original lineup set. And as we played along and did different things, right, we experimented with this at 150 and 80 throughout the day. So, but we will automatically resort your lineups in a given build to match the most up-to-date projections as sims run throughout the day. With that said, it is always, always, always way better to build a brand new build when you are ready to actually enter your lineups into your contests rather than going into an old build and just refreshing later. Because when you build a new build, you get a brand new set of 500 or 1,500 lineups that are optimized for that particular set of projections. In this case, all we're doing is picking out the best 20 from a pool of 500 that was built on old information. But what you want to do is build a new set of 500 that is optimized for the new information. So, all right. Wow. That felt like a bit of a kind of a sprint through today. There was a lot of interesting conversations, a lot of interesting questions coming in on today's stream. Lots to talk about here. I don't see any other trickling in here. So I think we'll go ahead and leave it there. Yeah, looks good. So enjoy your contests tonight. There is a lot of DFS to play tonight, this weekend. A lot going on. I was entering today. I was entering my NBA lineups. I'm playing NASCAR tonight, probably tomorrow, probably Sunday. League of Legends going on. We've got this MMA tomorrow. Pretty decent looking card. Hockey, obviously. Got all kinds of stuff. So enjoy it. Enjoy your weekends. We will be right back here again next week on Monday. So take care. And we will see you guys next week. See ya.